What is happening, guys? Welcome to your fourth SmartExaminer designer tutorial. Well, in this tutorial I'll be talking about the concept of the paper, the question, excuse me, what was I thinking? Alright, coming to the question, basically, as you know, we just have one type of question currently now, but on the next update, okay, we're gonna have more question types. Now, the properties of the questions, I'm just going to explain them, and I would use this time also to talk about some other features of the application. Now, the option count is very obvious. Okay, the number of options which will be available by default is 4. You have option A, B, C, and D, but I could change this to be anything within 2 and 10. Okay, let me say the option count is 6. Okay, you can see that it introduced new options. Basically that's what happens. Now the correct option is what the answer is gonna be. Okay, this is very self-explanatory. Now the next thing here is allow shuffle choices. When we talk about shuffle choices, we mean these options here, can it be shuffled? By default, yes it is, which means that I could be writing this exam and my option A for this very question is different from the option A of this very question for the next user. Okay, by default it is yes, but you can change this if you do not want that feature. On the question section, like we talked about, we could change the section of this question to anything we want from within here. And the next thing we'll talk about is the add case study or passage. Now, talking about case study, we're talking about something like a guide for this question that can be used to give a guide to answering this question. For instance, it could be in a case of a comprehension whereby you want the user to read the comprehension passage, okay, and provide answers based on that. We could just enable this by saying yes. Okay, by saying yes, as you can see here, we have the case study or passage which we can type in here, and coming to the question preview, we can see the case study. Now the title is case study by default, but you can change the label from the next property, as you see here, case study label, to whatever you want. You can change it to passage, you can change it to comprehension, to basically whatever it is, you just type in there. Okay, it just changes and shows up. Now, it could also be that this case study is something like sample problems that has been solved, which is a guideline to solving the question for some kind of aptitude questions, for instance, whereby you've solved some kind of sample problems, and based on the problems you want the user to come up with the same logic to solve the question. So that can also suffice in this case, but it's up to you basically to if you want a case study or you do not want a case study. Okay, now I'm going to talk about setting the default properties of questions, exams, and papers. If we come to edit, you can see configure defaults. Now, as you can see here, we're having some default properties for questions, papers, and exam. Alright, now the default instruction is choose the correct option. You can change it to anything. The default option count is this, so you can also change it so that you do not have to always set them from within the properties section, so that whenever you create a new of that type, it automatically takes from the default settings. For instance, I can say I want my default option count to be 5. I do not want it to shuffle choices, and I want a case study, and I want the case study label to be passage. On the default minutes for a paper, I probably want let's say 50 minutes. Default section arrangement is sequential, and let me just leave the others for now. Now I could save these changes, okay, and it saves, but it's not gonna affect immediately because we did not check the apply as default setting. Okay, now this apply as default setting is something that would force this to be activated, okay, whenever we create a new of either a question, a paper, or the exam. Okay, this is just used so that if, for instance, you want to modify things and you do not want to generate and inherit from the default settings, you can just come and uncheck this and still leave your normal default settings out. This the way you configured it. So what I'm going to do is to click on Save Changes Now. Okay, and if I create a new question, for instance, I come to question 7 now. Okay, I can see my option count is 5, which I set. Allow shuffle choices is no, which I set. Add case studies, yes, which I set. And the case study label is passage. Same thing applies to the paper and the exam, just exactly the way you want it to be. That's exactly the way it's going to be. Alright, the next thing I'm going to talk about is to talk about these fields here, the edit field, and talk about each of them, what they do and what you can do with them basically. Now, this very first one is to talk about the style of the text, how it's going to be. Okay, you can make it a paragraph by default, okay, but by default it is a body text, which means it is just simple. You can just move up and down it, and it takes that shape. But if you want a paragraph, which means whenever I press and enter, it gives a paragraph space. Now let me explain this for you. If I change this to be a paragraph, now I'm typing some stuff. If I click on an enter, okay, it's still being affected as a body text. Let me make this right. Paragraph. If I type some stuff, clicking on enter, you can see it gives me a paragraph space. But if I come here and I'm typing in this and I click on next, it just goes to the next line directly. From the paragraph, you can also get that effect by holding down the shift button and pressing the enter. Okay, if I hold down the shift and I press enter, basically it gives me the same effect as I have here. So you can work with that. As you can see, that's basically what how that works. Now the pre-formatted, it's in case you want you're writing something like a code. Let's say it's a question that has to do with something like computer science, and let me just say I'm writing something like a code in C++ with my int main method and stuff like this. I could highlight this and say it's actually pre-formatted. As you can see, it changes the code syntax and it preserves the spaces you put. Okay, it just preserves the spaces you put and makes the text look more like the code formatted. Well, I'm not going to go deep into talking about this. You can explore with these on how you want it to be like. Okay, but it just resembles your normal HTML coding. It just resembles your normal HTML coding, and you can mess around with it. The next thing is going to talk about the font size. We made some kind of fixed kind of font size. Okay, for instance, I could change this to something like a large font, okay, a small font, a medium font. We removed the idea of changing the font size directly to pixels or points as you might be used to. Alright, the next thing you might want to do is to change the color. Okay, you can change the color of your text. You have different ranges which you can pick from, and you can just change the color of your text to whatever it is you want it to be, and it just shows up for you. Next thing is your regular formatting, which you're very common with Microsoft Word and normal text. So I'm just going to skip all of those. Next thing we can do is to have images. You can introduce images into your project. For instance, I can click on this, okay, and having my image, I'm just going to click on browse to pick an image from my system. Okay, I'm just going to have SmartExaminer designer, the tutorial, and let me just I'm having a question here. I'm just going to pick from it and click on OK, and then we'll have the question image presented here. One thing you need to be aware of is that while you can use images, there are restrictions to images. the width of your image cannot be bigger than 650 pixels, okay, and the size also cannot be greater than 500 kilobytes. That is so that it can show very well on many systems, and also when we're downloading the files from the web server, it's not going to take so long. Those restrictions are just something that you can overcome by working with text editors. For instance, I could use an image like this, and it shows very well. This is just about 500 pixel images. But if I try to use this other image, okay, it doesn't even let me add it. Say image width must not be greater than 650 pixels. So that's something you might need to look into, okay, because we do not want a situation whereby some of your images does not show within the applications on systems that are smaller. So we are believing that whatever image you're using, the information can be contained within 650 pixels, okay. So you can use images within questions, you can use them within options, just basically anyhow you want it, okay. You can also change the image later on, okay. For instance, I want to change it back to this. I do not want to use the image I used before. You can just change it, and just right clicking on it, you can click on image properties. So I can take that off with a normal backspace. Excuse me. Next thing we're going to talk about is working with tables. You can basically use tables here. Number of rows, the number of columns you want. You can give your table some sort of width. For instance, I can say my table is 450 pixels. If you want it to have a border, you want to create some pattern within it. If you're used to HTML, this thing should be familiar with you. Okay, we basically designed it based on that idea because we believe that we have more web developers than we have programmers. So I hope you understand what I'm trying to talk about. We developed it with that kind of idea. So you can work with this, and you just use your tables, and you can style it. You can introduce background colors. Okay, I can right click on this table, come to table properties. If I do not want this table anymore, I click on delete. Now, one thing you need to know, deleting a table work with a backspace might not work efficiently. So what you might want to do is to come here and click on delete table. Okay, you can style a row, give it a background color, and whatever it is you want, basically you just whatever it is you want. You can style a row, you can remove the border, you can style a cell, okay, and it just works exactly the way you just place it, okay. That's working with tables for the now. So what I'm gonna do is to just delete this table. I really do not need it. Now we have some symbols which might get you crazy. Okay, these are symbols. Okay, we have several of them, and it's just crazy, man. You can just pick from whatever it is you want, and you can introduce symbols, some mathematical symbols and stuffs. Clicking on them, it adds it to the field. Okay, it doesn't close automatically because we believe it's possible you might want to work with several symbols. So I'm just going to click on this too, and I can have my symbols here. You can always change the font size of them if they're not exactly the size you want them to be, and that's about it. And then you can introduce stuffs. For instance, I want to have superscripts and subscripts. Let's say I'm having something like x squared. Okay, I could make this a squared by highlighting on it and clicking on the superscript. Okay, as you can see, it turns it into an x squared. I could also have a subscript whereby I'm having something like a log of 2 to base 10, something like this. So basically this is supposed to be a subscript, and I'm just going to click on this, and it works out just exactly the way you want. The next thing we did was to introduce some sample scripts because we believe that there's some kind of expressions which will be difficult for you to just develop on your own, and so we created some kind of expressions which you can modify. You can just click on them and modify to your taste. Okay, we'll keep adding to this list as we go along. Okay, keep adding to this list as we go along. For instance, you want something like this, you can just come and modify this. It could be you want something else like 56x plus y all over. You just modify it to what you want, and it shows exactly the way you want it to be. Okay, in the next tutorial, would actually be working with creating a real question and working with some of the tools which we have, and show how you can really create some kind of advanced question types and stuff like that. Now we have the explanation or reference, which if you want to be available based on your exam settings, you want the answers to show at the end of the exam, you can just introduce your explanations here, and that works fine. Now one thing you can also do is to export content from a field to another field. For instance, you want to move what you have here to this other field. It's not easy for you to just use your Control A to control copy and you paste it here. It's not going to show exactly the way you want it. So what we did was to create a system whereby you can import and export the raw content exactly the way it is. For instance, I want this to be available. I can just click on export, and I can just call it let me just say e-table, for instance. Okay, and I save it there, and I want it to be available here. I can just import it here, clicking on this, and it just copies exactly the way it is down here. Alright, the next thing we did was to pull from previous question. That's what this does. For instance, you do not want to copy something from the previous question. You're having a case study or passage which is a comprehension. Okay, the comprehension, by the way, needs to be imputed in all questions. Okay, there's no groupings when it comes to designing questions with SmartExaminer. So what we did was to just introduce a feature whereby I could pull from the previous content. For instance, let me say in my question 6, I'm having let me say I'm having a case study here, and I'm having some jargons text in here, and in my question 7, I want this stuff to be available. Okay, what we just do is just to say pull from previous content, and I'm just going to pull from previous content, and it's just going to give me exactly what I have in my question 6. So that's one feature we introduced here. So you might also want to check that out if that's exactly what you need. Alright, we spent a long time in this very tutorial. Thank you very much for watching. In the next tutorial, we'll really create some genuine questions and show you how to work with some complex stuff, for example, mathematical questions and stuff like that. Alright, thank you very much for watching. See you in the next tutorial. Kudos.